The ice gave out beneath Knox Bellamy without warning the way most terrible things do. One moment he was 3 strides from shore, Fern's lead wrapped twice around his left hand. The next, the frozen surface split and swallowed him to the chest, and the January dark of Bras d'Or Lake closed around him with a coldness so complete it felt almost deliberate. He didn't shout. 30 years of special operations had burned the impulse from him. Noise attracted the wrong kind of attention, and panic used air. He pressed both forearms onto the ice shelf in front of him and held still while the cold finished arriving. The shore was 10 meters away. 10 meters might as well have been 10 kilometers in water this temperature. Fern stood at the edge of the bank, stiff-legged, her amber eyes fixed on him. She had made it. He'd thrown her lead forward and she'd scrambled to solid ground. He'd felt the jerk of it on his wrist right before the surface gave. Now she paced the shoreline in a tight, frantic line, her honey and charcoal coat dark with ice pellets. Rook was behind her, further up the bank. The younger male, slightly heavier, black-saddled, with one ear that stood straight and one that folded at the tip, had not moved since Knox went under. He stood with his forelegs spread as though bracing against something only he could feel. Knox's phone had skidded out of his breast pocket when he grabbed for the ice. It lay on the surface 3 feet beyond reach, screen still lit, uselessly bright. He looked at Rook, at the darkness beyond the field, where the road curved north toward a farmhouse with a yellow porch light. Half a kilometer, maybe less. A distance Rook had traveled exactly twice, both times with Knox walking ahead of him. The ice flexed under his arms. His fingers were losing the specific sensation that meant grip. Rook. His voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. The dog's head swung toward him. Knox raised one arm and pointed toward the far field, toward Wendell. Get help, he paused. Go. Rook looked at Fern, at Knox, his folded ear pressed flat against his skull. Go. 1 terrible second passed in the dark and the sleet. Then Rook turned and disappeared. Knox listened to the sound of paws striking frozen ground, growing smaller, swallowed entirely by the storm. There was no way to know whether the dog would reach Wendell's door or simply run until he was lost in the Cape Breton dark. There was no way to know anything except that the ice under his forearms had begun to flex, and the cold had reached his ribs. And Fern was still there on the bank, pressing her chest against the frozen ground, holding the lead taut with the full weight of herself. He pressed his chin to the ice shelf and talked to her quietly. He was not certain what he said. He only knew he needed her to stay, and she did. 6 weeks earlier, Knox had driven to Glace Bay in a truck that smelled of rust and take-out coffee, with no particular intention of stopping at the animal rescue on Reserve Street. He had been in Cape Breton for 4 months. He had driven that road perhaps 40 times. He had never once looked at the hand-painted sign beside the chain-link fence. That afternoon he looked. He told himself it was the sign that stopped him. It read, "Dogs need homes, come in." Someone had painted a paw print beside the letters and then painted over it badly, so the outline remained visible beneath the green. Knox had spent 30 years reading things people half-covered. He recognized the shelter was not turning people away. It was hoping they would walk in on their own. He sat in the parking lot for 4 minutes. Then he went inside. The woman at the front desk had close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She introduced herself as Dolores Pratt. She was 61, patient in the way of people who have spent decades working with frightened animals. Which is to say she did not rush him, did not ask what he was looking for, and did not fill the silence with unnecessary sound. She simply led him down the corridor. "We have 11 right now," she said, "mostly mixed breeds, 2 labs, and these 2 at the end." The enclosure at the far wall held a pair of German shepherds, 8 months old, from the same litter. The male was on his feet before Knox reached the gate, dark-muzzled, tail working hard, one ear up and one folded, giving him an expression of perpetual and slightly unearned confidence. He pushed his nose between the bars and inhaled Knox's jacket sleeve with the thoroughness of a customs agent. The female did not come forward. She sat in the center of the enclosure with her forelegs straight and her amber eyes moving carefully over Knox's face, his hands, the angle of his shoulders. She had a honey-gold face and a charcoal saddle, and the left side of her muzzle bore a small healed scar. Caught on wire before they came in, Dolores said, assessed as sound and healthy. Dolores used the word thoughtful. She said it the way you would describe a person. What happened to their previous placement? Knox asked. Family surrendered them after a move. Third time in 8 months. 3 owners? 2. The first bought both and couldn't manage the energy. The second wanted just Rook. The male, but he refused food for 3 days when they separated them. They brought Fern back and we got both. Dolores folded her arms. They've been together since the day they were born, never spent a night apart. Knox looked at the female. She had not moved. She watched him the way he had once watched a door from the wrong side. Not with fear, but with the deliberate attention of someone deciding whether an opening was safe before committing to it. I came for one, Knox said. Most people do, Dolores said. You still can. I won't make you feel guilty about it. She said it evenly, as though she had said it many times and meant it every time. Knox crouched down to the male's level. Rook pressed a paw under the gate immediately, scrabbling at the concrete as if a closed barrier were a personal affront. His collar tag rang against the bars. Knox did not look at him. He was watching Fern. She had not moved toward him, but her eyes had not left him either. She was not afraid. He could read the difference, she was deciding. He recognized that language. He had been fluent in it for years. The language of people who had been hurt enough times that trust no longer arrived automatically, but could still be earned by someone patient enough not to lie. His late wife Colette had tried to teach him that this language applied to himself, too. She had said it plainly, the way she said most true things. You are allowed to let someone help you, Knox. Letting someone in doesn't make you weaker. It makes you human. He had thought about those words every day since she died, and had not believed them once. He looked at Rook, then at Fern, then at the gate between them. How much for both? He asked. Dolores helped him load the crates into the truck bed and covered them against the November rain. She said little beyond the practical, feeding schedule, vaccination records, the name of a trainer in Sydney if he needed a referral. Before closing the tailgate, she paused. She watches, Dolores said, meaning Fern. Quietly, she'll take longer than him to trust you, but once she does, she won't stop. Knox nodded. He drove north out of Glace Bay as the light fell behind the Northumberland hills, listening to 2 dogs breathing behind him, one restless, one still. The property sat on a short peninsula north of Boularderie Island, 6 kilometers from the nearest paved road, and surrounded by old-growth spruce and the gray reach of the lake. It had been Colette's family land for 3 generations. She had talked about it every January, since Knox had known her. The way the ice came in overnight and transformed the shore into something from another century, the smell of spruce smoke and frozen salt air, the particular quiet of a place without traffic and without neighbors close enough to see your lights. She had wanted them to retire there. Knox had said eventually for 11 years, which he now understood had been a form of cruelty, though not one he had intended. She was diagnosed in October. By March she was gone. In August, Knox had signed the papers on the property. He had no plan for it. He only knew that leaving it unsold felt like abandoning something she had started, and that this was the closest he had come to anything resembling purpose in the 8 months, since he had become the kind of man who parks facing the exit and lies awake checking the sounds of an empty house. The property held all of Colette's things in boxes he had packed and not opened. Her wool sweaters, her bird books, the chipped mug she had used every morning for 15 years. He had moved them here the way you move a problem to a different room, not solving anything, only changing which wall it was against. The nearest neighbor was Wendell Ash, 67, who farmed the land south of the tree line and kept sheep and a rusting tractor and opinions about the weather that he delivered with the gravity of official announcements. Knox had met him the first week. Wendell had brought over a steel thermos and a loaf of brown bread. And when Knox had said he didn't need anything, Wendell had set both on the porch step and walked back to his truck without argument. Knox had eaten the bread over 4 days. The first weeks with Rook and Fern were not quiet. Rook prevented that, but they had a rhythm Knox hadn't planned on. Morning feeds, long walks along the shore, short training sessions in the field with the lake gray and still behind them. Rook learned stay by the 4th day, forgot it on the 5th, relearned it on the 6th with an expression of genuine personal revelation. Fern learned it on day 2 and never forgot it, though she added her own amendment. She would stay wherever Knox asked, but her eyes followed him to the edge of whatever distance she would tolerate. Wendell came by twice a week with coffee and a willingness to work that he dressed up as conversation. He helped Knox replace a rotted dock post on the lake shore, sanded the access road without being asked, and said nothing about the boxes in the spare room except once, passing the open doorway, remarking that good wool held its shape better kept flat. Knox said nothing. Wendell moved to the kitchen and poured himself coffee. The two men talked about fencing and weather and the state of the road. They did not talk about Colette. Knox was grateful for this in the way you are grateful for things you don't deserve. One evening Knox called his daughter. Ainsley was 31, lived in Halifax, worked emergency nursing, and had not spoken to her father in close to 18 months. Not since the funeral, where they had stood on opposite sides of a burial that neither of them had known how to survive. He had not handled the year before the funeral well. He had not handled the funeral well. He had told himself she needed space, which was the most comfortable version of a truth that was harder to hold. The phone rang 4 times and went to voicemail. He listened to her voice on the recording and then said, "It's your father. I have dogs now. I'm at the Cape Breton property. I thought you might want to know." He ended the call. Fern raised her head from the rug and looked at him. She did not come to him. She simply acknowledged that something had happened and waited to see whether he needed company. He didn't deserve the consideration. She offered it anyway. The ice storm came in off the Atlantic on a Tuesday night in January with no particular ceremony. The forecast had given a 12-hour warning. Knox spent the afternoon checking the generator, filling water containers, stocking the wood box, and moving both dogs' crates against the central wall. He brought Rook and Fern inside before dark and checked the door latches twice. He fell asleep before 11. He woke at 2:17 to an empty kitchen. Fern's crate stood open. The side door was slightly ajar, the hook lock disengaged. Knox, dressed without the overhead light, took his headlamp and a long lead and followed her tracks into the ice-crusted field. The tracks moved in a straight line toward the lake. He found her at the shoreline, standing at the ice edge with her ears pressed low and her body rigid in a way he had not seen from her before, not the watchful stillness of her nature, but something else. Alarm without panic, certainty without explanation. She was staring at a point on the ice surface roughly 15 meters out, where a gray irregularity interrupted the flat expanse. Knox swept his headlamp across it. A crack, old, refrozen, running in an arc toward the eastern shore, nothing else visible. But Fern had not moved, and her muzzle was pressed nearly to the ice surface, and she was trembling in the way Knox had learned, over these weeks, meant not cold or fear, but a particular quality of attention he did not yet have a name for. He had trusted that attention once before. The morning she had stopped at the fence line and refused to cross. 3 days before the post beside it simply sank into the waterlogged soil. The evening she had pressed her ear flat against the kitchen floor for a full minute before moving her food bowl 2 feet to the left. And Knox, following some instinct he could not explain, had shifted his chair to where the bowl had been, and 3 hours later a section of ceiling plaster had come down onto his original seat. He did not fully understand what she sensed. He had stopped needing to. He stepped onto the ice carefully, testing his weight close to the bank before shifting it forward. The surface held. He crossed the first 4 meters in wide, deliberate steps, distributing weight, watching for flex, listening. He reached Fern and clipped the lead to her collar. "Come on, let's go in." She came, 3 steps obedient. The lead went slack, then taut she had paused. Knox took 1 more step. The ice went sideways beneath his left boot, then both feet, then the world dropped. He thought, in the water, about Colette. Not her final months, which he had spent in the particular paralysis of a man who has survived every difficult thing and found nothing in his reserves for this one. He thought about the morning she'd been accepted to nursing college, nearly 30 years ago, when she had come downstairs making a sound he'd never heard from her before, a single, clear note of joy that had nothing composed or careful about it. He had been trying to make toast and had burned it completely, watching her. He thought about the way she held a coffee cup with both hands even in July, the way she fell asleep reading and then denied it, the way she said his name, not Knox, the way most people said it, like something closed, like a locked thing, but as if it were the answer to a question she had already known. He had not let himself think about her this way in months. He had been too careful. Grief, he had decided somewhere along the way, was a door best kept shut because opening it let in too much. Fern was still there on the bank. He could hear her. At some point she had braced her forelegs against the frozen shore and held the lead taut between them, and that slight tension, almost nothing, the weight of a promise, had helped him keep his forearms on the ice shelf. He called her name every few minutes to hear his own voice. Her answering sound was not quite a bark and not quite a whine, and it came at a steady interval, and he matched his breathing to it. Rook was somewhere in the dark. Knox did not know how long he had been in the water. Long enough for the cold to have moved past discomfort into something more administrative, his body cataloging damage the way it had been trained to do, calmly, in sequence, without attaching feeling to the facts. He heard Wendell before he saw the light. The particular rhythm of that gait, cane striking frozen ground, and a string of Nova Scotian profanity, delivered in the measured tone of a man who has seen worse but doesn't see why that should prevent commentary. The rope landed 2 feet from Knox's left hand on the second throw. It took both of them 4 minutes to get Knox onto solid ground. He lay on his back in the sleet, looking at a sky with no stars. Wendell crouched beside him with one hand on Knox's collar, saying something practical and urgent, and behind him, Rook stood with his chest heaving and his paws braced in the frozen mud, soaked through, one foreclaw torn where he had climbed something hard in the dark. The folded ear was flat against his head. His whole body shook. He had run half a kilometer in January sleet to a farmhouse he had visited twice. Knox reached out one hand. Rook pressed his head into it and trembled. The hospital in Sydney kept Knox 2 nights. Moderate hypothermia, no lasting damage. The doctor used the phrase remarkable baseline fitness in a tone that suggested she found it personally inconvenient. Knox listened to her instructions about warmth and rest, and made the face he had learned to make when agreeing to things he intended to revisit privately. Ainsley arrived on the second morning. He had not called her. Wendell had found the number in Knox's phone and made the call himself, in the manner of a man who considers other people's privacy a reasonable obstacle rather than an absolute one. She stood in the doorway of the hospital room for a moment before coming in. She had Colette's coloring, dark eyes, the same way of standing that suggested she was choosing her moment rather than hesitating. She was wearing a Halifax general jacket over her clothes, which meant she had come from a shift, which meant she had not stopped to plan what she would say. Knox appreciated that. Planning things to say was a form of distance. "The dogs," she said first. "Are they all right?" "Wendell has them." She nodded, sat in the chair beside the bed. "I listened to your voicemail about 15 times. I only said I had dogs." "I know." She looked at her hands. "That's not why I listened to it 15 times. You haven't called me in a year and a half, and you called to tell me about dogs. I didn't know what to do with that." Knox had no answer that was adequate. He had spent a long time confusing silence with respect, withdrawal with dignity, isolation with the absence of burden. Colette had known this about him. She had loved him around it rather than through it, which was either very patient or quietly heartbreaking, depending on the angle. "I should have called sooner," he said, "about more than dogs." "Yeah," Ainsley looked up, "you should have." They sat together in the room's quiet for a while, not requiring it to be anything other than what it was. Wendell drove Knox home on a Thursday morning under a sky scoured clean by the storm. The lake was still except for a line of mergigansers moving along the southern reed bank, and the dock post Knox and Wendell had repaired in November stood straight in the ice. The access road had been sanded and cleared. Everything looked from the truck window, like a place that had decided to continue. Rook reached the end of the driveway before the truck stopped moving. He did not jump. He sat, trembling, and pressed his nose against Knox's boot when Knox stepped out and made a sound that was not a bark. Lower than that, more particular. His torn foreclaw had been cleaned and wrapped. One ear stood straight, the other folded. Fern came down the porch steps slowly, the way she always moved, measuring the distance before crossing it, deciding before arriving. She had a mud-gray stain along her left shoulder where the ice had left its mark. She stopped 2 feet from Knox, looked at him, then walked forward and leaned the full length of her body against his leg and stayed. He stood in the cold with one hand on each of them and looked at the lake. The ice was pale and faultless in the morning light. It gave no indication of what it had taken or what it had given back, which Knox supposed was its right. Places held what they were asked to hold and then let it go. People, he was beginning to think, could learn the same. Ainsley came back the following weekend. She stayed 3 days. She helped Knox open the boxes in the spare room, not all of them, and not with ceremony, just the quiet work of unpacking things that had waited long enough. She found Colette's bird books and lined them on the window ledge. She found the chipped mug and set it on the kitchen shelf where the morning light would catch it. On the last afternoon, she sat on the dock with Fern stretched across her feet and Rook attempting to negotiate with a jay at the tree line. She'd have loved them, Ainsley said. She would have, Knox agreed. She would have loved that you stayed. Ainsley looked at him sideways. She always said she wanted you to have somewhere to land. Knox looked at the lake. The refrozen crack was invisible now, smooth and continuous with the rest of the surface. Fern pressed her chin against Ainsley's shin and closed her eyes. There are things that come apart slowly. Trust, a family, a man's willingness to believe that someone is still listening for the sound of his return. And there are things that come back the same way. Not suddenly, not without effort, but in the way that frozen ground begins to soften in March, without any single moment you can name as the turning. Wendell came by most mornings that winter, with coffee and reasonable pretexts. Dolores Pratt called once to ask after the dogs, and remained on the phone for 40 minutes talking about nothing in particular, which Knox understood was precisely the point. Ainsley drove up twice more before the snow left the hills, staying a little longer each time. Fern grew into her role quietly, as she did everything. Learning the fence lines, learning the sounds the lake made before weather changed, learning the difference between the wind that brought rain and the wind that brought ice. She walked the property each morning in a careful circuit that ended wherever Knox was standing. Rook continued to operate on the theory that speed and enthusiasm were interchangeable with competence, and continued to discover that they were not, and continued, undeterred, to try again. Knox found, as winter moved toward spring, that he had begun leaving the kitchen light on when he went to the dock in the evenings. He couldn't have said when the habit started. He only noticed it one night, coming back across the dark field with Fern beside him. And Rook somewhere just ahead, when the yellow square of the kitchen window appeared between the spruce trees and his pace quickened slightly, without his choosing to quicken it. Something had been left on. Something was expecting his return. He had spent the better part of his adult life believing that needing no one was the same as being strong, that the man who required nothing from others was the man least likely to fail. He had been very accomplished at being that man. He had also been very alone inside him, in the specific way of people who have mistaken the absence of dependence for the presence of freedom. What Rook had done on a January night, running through sleet on 4 frozen paws toward the only neighbor he had ever met, carrying the weight of 2 animals who could not follow him, was not complicated. It was not brave in the calculated way Knox had been trained to be brave. It was simpler than that. It was asking for help, running toward it without knowing whether it would come, trusting that it would. Knox had watched him disappear into the dark and felt something he could not immediately name. Not pride, not quite hope, but the particular recognition of seeing in someone else a thing you have not yet learned to do yourself, and understanding for the first time that it is possible. He was learning. By April there were curtains on the kitchen window. A photograph on the shelf beside the chipped mug. Knox and Colette at the Cape Breton Highlands, young, laughing at something just outside the frame. A second chair at the table. A notepad beside the phone where he wrote down things he wanted to tell Ainsley. Some mornings he stood on the dock and looked at the lake and thought about Colette, not with the sealed, burning grief that had lived in his chest for 2 years, but with something more open. The memory of her laugh when she got hiccups mid-sentence. The way she slept with wool socks on regardless of the season. The particular warmth of existing alongside someone who has seen everything in you and stayed. He was not certain he believed in grace in any formal sense, but he believed in ice that should have held and didn't. He believed in a dog who ran half a kilometer in January sleet without any training, guided only by the specific urgency of loving something he refused to lose. He believed that the heart, even one as carefully defended as his, will begin, given the right company and enough time, to open the way a frozen lake opens in spring. Not all at once, not without danger, but with a thoroughness that once begun is very difficult to stop. There are times a man believes he is choosing a dog, and there are times 2 dogs choose a man. Find the space inside him that has been empty long enough, and settle into it without ceremony, and wait with the calm certainty of creatures who have always understood that the person they are waiting for is going to come home. Knox came home. He came home to muddy paws on a clean floor, a mug on the shelf, a daughter who answered on the second ring, and 2 dogs who had never once stopped believing he would walk back through that door. If this story found its way to you today, share it with someone who needs to hear that it is not too late. To reach out, to return, to let someone stand beside you in the dark. Leave a comment about the person or animal who stayed with you through a hard season, and subscribe for more stories of grit, loyalty, and the quiet grace that reaches us when we finally stop turning away.